All right, hello everyone. Welcome to this session on designing your data strategy for success. My name is Gaetan Belby. I'm part of the professional services team at Tableau based in the London office, working mostly for French-speaking markets. I've been with the company for about 3 years, and my role as a professional services consultant is to go to our different customers, help them define strategies, help them deploy server, help them get trained on the product, so a whole range of things. And I've been doing this for about 3 years, so I've seen many different situations. And what I want to do today is kind of share some of the things I've seen and some of the successful strategies that have been implemented. So I just want to start asking a question. Who here in the room works as an analyst or a desktop user? Okay, great. What about IT? Perfect. What about Tableau server administrators? Awesome. And database administrators? Okay. Some people do everything. All right, this is what we want. This is great. So I think this talk is going to apply pretty much to all of you. I'm going to cover some subjects on data governance, what you can do in Tableau server, for the end user on how you can connect to a whole range of different data sources and leverage the power of each of these data sources, and touch a bit on security as well, and hopefully that'll help you set up a strategy for your company. So what makes a successful data strategy? I think for different people, depending on what role you're in, it means something different. Maybe for a business user, it means choosing between live or extract. Maybe for somebody in IT or database management, it means applying proper security. Well, the short answer is that it's not just about live or extract connections. Really, a successful data strategy is also about providing easy access to your data for the end user and providing secure access to that data as well. So really, it's governance, it's accessibility, it's security, it's performance also for your end users, and auditability, which will be a subject we'll touch on as well. So this is the agenda for the next hour. So like I said, now we're going to start on data governance. Then we're going to touch on the concept of having cold, warm, and hot data, and just different types of data that users and different types of users may want to connect to. Then security, so securing your access, making sure that any security that's set up by your company is respected when you're connecting to data. Then the user journey through all of these different components. And finally, how you can audit your data sources to optimize them or delete them if they're not used. So data governance. What is data governance for us? Well, the first thing is a business logic. A business logic is really that single source of truth where you can find and you're certain that you have all the right data, the right calculations, the right metadata. It's also data security. So does it meet legal, regulatory, and compliance requirements? And finally, auditability, where we can monitor who is using what data source. Are they being used across different workbooks? And maybe you've seen this actually at the keynote yesterday, where they mentioned about some new features we're adding to do this maybe in a more efficient way. But what I'm going to present today is also what you can do with the current product and really what I've done at my different customers. So to show you an example of what it looks like for an end user in a governed environment and a non-governed environment. In an ungoverned environment, the desktop user, so the person creating those reports and connecting to data, will connect to the data source directly. So it will require installing drivers. You will not have any control over what the user is connecting to, so you can start connecting to different types of tables and maybe doing joins that are not the best joins to do, and then end up with data sources that are huge and that are querying your database and maybe making it crash. So in a governed environment, desktop users actually go through Tableau server. In Tableau server, we have something we call the data server, where you can publish data sources and you can centrally manage data sources. So the point here is that those users will always go through Tableau server to connect to the data source. So you'd have a list of published data source on there, and they query through the Tableau server, and Tableau server then in turn will send a query to the data sources themselves. So those data sources that I'm mentioning, maybe some of you are confused by what that is. It can be .tds, .tde, a whole bunch of different things. But really, those data sources are the founding blocks for data governance. They connect, when you connect directly to any data source or to any database, that will create a data source. When you create an extract, that will create a data source. So the data connection and the data source is two separate things because the data source also has metadata attached to it, and I'll touch on that right afterwards. So like the second bullet point, the first bullet point mentions actually, metadata about the connection, so what tables did the user connect to, what type of joins, has he created any values like calculated fields or groups that we can reuse elsewhere? And so all of this information is then saved and stored as XML in the workbook, in the TDS, so the Tableau data source. A Tableau data source contains a TDC and a TDE. So TDE is Tableau data extract, TDC, Tableau data connection, and the Tableau data source is really the whole thing together, okay? Whether it's TDC or TDE. And finally, it can be centrally managed on Tableau server, so on that data server. So when I talk about metadata and what metadata you can have attached to your data source, TDS, metadata is, like I said, the connection information to the database. So, for example, the credentials, what is the server name of where you're connecting, the port number, but also how you're connecting, which tables, what type of joins, what are the join keys, etc. Also field aliases. I don't know if you're familiar with field aliases, but within a column, you can rename fields. That's actually metadata that's kept in the Tableau data source. It's not writing anything back to your database. It's just kept as metadata in the Tableau data source that you may want to share then with other users. Groups, so you can also create custom groups within Tableau. In version 10 now you can use groups in calculated field, which is great. Before you couldn't. Calculations, so any metrics that have been calculated by somebody that may know how to do a certain, a certain calculation that an end user may not be able to do, but also when you want to share those calculations with other people, so they can be reused in other workbooks. That again is saved as metadata in the Tableau data source. Hierarchies between different columns. So when you drag and drop one field on top of another, that creates a hierarchy. Folders for fields, just to show you actually, maybe some people are not always familiar with how you create folders for your different fields. Where you've got two options when you're organizing your data. Is either use the data source organization, or if you, let's do this, group by folder. And actually now this changes it so you can create new folders and have your custom folders created where users can easily navigate navigate to the different metrics that you have in there. Okay, so create a folder. So this is custom metadata, custom data preparation that I guess you can do, and that will be saved into the Tableau data source. And I should have stayed in Tableau. Default properties. Default properties can be default aggregation, default colors assigned to dimensions. So typically if you have company color codes that you always want to use on, let's say, categories of products, you can assign default colors to these products or to these categories. So then every time this data is reused in any other workbook, that will always be the default color. Again, this is saved in the Tableau data source and shared across any workbook that's using it. And finally, field descriptions, and that's what I wanted to show you as well. This is not necessarily always known by everybody. But you can describe and add comments to your fields. So say I've got here, this is data, by the way, on baseball data. And I can add some description from my default properties and say, well, this was created with a calculation that gives you home runs per year. Maybe one field comes from one side, another field comes from another side. So when the user hovers over that field, the description appears. Again, this is really useful. And recently, I actually found on GitHub this person that actually created a small tool that allows you to import definitions from your databases directly. So I wanted to show that to you. Just quickly, if you take down Tableau definition import utility, it's really useful. I was in a scenario actually last week in Switzerland where my customer wanted to import all of his field descriptions from SQL Server. His SQL Server had fields that were coming from one database, from another database, from an ERP system, and he wanted just to import those descriptions and not have to type them in manually, because obviously typing in manually for 250 columns, it could be quite annoying. So we used this, and it worked really well. So thank you to Mr. Becker Ben. This is free, yeah. Yeah. Okay, so once you have all of this metadata, what do you do with it? How do you share it? Well, it's all about the data server that I mentioned earlier. The data server allows for any source to be defined once and then shared through Tableau server and reused across a bunch of other workbooks. So in this schema, as we can see, somebody connected to data, to different tables, and got data on profitability in this example, shares it to the server, and all the other users can reuse that. And all of the metadata that I mentioned earlier, that would be shared in the Tableau data source that you're publishing. So metadata is managed centrally, and one good thing about that is that any workbooks that you have connected to that metadata or to those Tableau data sources, whenever you make a change to that data source, all of the workbooks will inherit that change. So say you're changing the logic of a calculation that's being used across different workbooks from different departments, do that change in the Tableau data source, republish it, and all the workbooks will be updated automatically. Data security is enabled in Tableau Data Server via data source filters. I'm sure a lot of you have already used this. Finally, users can access centrally managed data sources via the web browser. So any user that's using the web editing tool, where they can't connect to new data sources, but they can only connect to data sources that have been published on the data server. And your Tableau desktop users as well. And one of these points as well mentioned that can be live connections or extracts. So a data source, like I mentioned earlier, is either a Tableau live connection or Tableau data extract. Both of them are published on the server along with the metadata contained in the Tableau data source. And finally, that's also a really useful point. If you want to manage how users are connecting to data, you don't want them to be able to authenticate on their own just because they may not have that information. You want to manage the drivers that they need to download, or that in this case they wouldn't need to download. All the drivers would go through Tableau server, so they don't have to download like an Oracle driver on their laptop, and which can be quite confusing. And sometimes, if IT doesn't allow you to download stuff on your own, I've seen companies where it can take a few weeks before you can actually connect. So why publish why publish your data source? So for reusability, for access control, when it's difficult to set up data sources, data stewards and data creators usually are two different people. So the data visualization creators, they would be the one connecting to the data, but the data stewards would be controlling those data sources and the metadata that goes with it. You only need to extract the data once, and then it's just a central installation and management for drivers. So where do you publish these data sources? Well, I kind of wanted to give you a small example of how you can structure Tableau Server, or how your Tableau Server can be structured. So it's easy to navigate to those data sources, but it's also easy to control what data has been certified. We talked a lot yesterday morning about certifying data sources. Well, at the moment, the way I do it at my customers is by creating projects. So this is an image of Tableau Server where you have first your site, so Tableau Server, then your sites. Sites are virtual entities of Tableau Server where you have different projects and different users. And within those sites, you have projects. So in this case, let's say I've got site for sales, and all those projects are for sales. Now, typically what I do is actually I separate the data projects with the dashboard projects. So the reason I do this is because users that will go into the production dashboard project I don't necessarily want them to see a bunch of dashboards and a bunch of data sources that are there. I really want them to be able to have like a quick, easy access to the information they're trying to get to. So I separate the data into another project, and then also I can control which users actually can connect and go to these projects. So typically, the authors of those dashboards, they can only see the data source project. They don't necessarily need to see the dashboard project. So they can connect very easily, and they're guided into connecting there easily. And the one last point here is that in this scenario, I use projects for sandbox, for testing, and then for production. So if I kind of take you through a typical flow of how a data source would be published and then transferred into production and used for a report, this is how it would look like. So I've got my server, my site is sales, and I've got those 3 projects that I talked about, so sales, sandbox, sales test, and sales production. Now, Carl, the project leader is able with his permissions to move content or define permissions at a project level, to assign permissions to users, and to assign permissions to content. So he's able to move stuff around, essentially, at this level. Now, we have this analyst from the sales team, Sam, who publishes a data source that is created. What Carl will do then is just move that to the sales test project. And finally, somebody that could be verifying the data, like a data steward named Dana, downloads the project, verifies the metadata, tests the metadata. If there are calculations, that he made on his own, verify that the calculations were made correctly. Are you doing a count distinct or a count? Have you made any joins that will give you huge numbers and tell you that you're making billions, but actually it's not the case? So Dana can test all of this information, publishes back up to the sales test project. At this point, Sam can verify again before it's moved into production, so make sure that that's what he's expecting. And finally, so Sam views it, and finally, Carl will move that to the sales production project, where all the other users can guarantee that this will be data you can trust, and that the calculations are right, and that the metadata is respected. So like company branding and stuff like that. So all of this data that we're kind of talking about at the moment, it can come in various types, forms, and sizes. And this is the concept that I introduced earlier of cold, warm, and hot data. Really cold, warm, and hot data is mainly in terms of how big it is and how fast it is. So different type of people will deal with cold data and warm data and hot data. But if we look, take a step back and kind of think of where all of our data is coming from, you may have process-generated data coming from business systems or web logs, machine-generated data from sensors like weather sensors or engine sensors, and human-generated data from social media campaign, tweeting about data 16 and all that stuff. So really, all of this data comes from different places, and it comes in a really unstructured way and in a huge format. So obviously your users are not directly connecting to this and getting all the information they want. There's some journey that the data goes through before you actually provide it to the end user, so he can get really quickly to the answer that he wants. And this is where we talk about cold, warm, hot data. So your cold data is where it all starts. Typically your data lake, where you store everything and anything, and where you ask unknown questions and get unknown answers. Then you have your warm data, your data warehouses. You already know the questions, you don't know the answers yet, but the data is moved already, and we already know that this data is prepared for entity analytics. And finally, the hot data, which typically is in-memory computing, is going to be very fast. We know the questions, we know the answers. And so essentially, your hot data is really the data that you move once you already have your dashboard. So what I recommend my users, and we'll do that I'll show you in a moment, is really start from your cold data, but create your extract only when you finish your dashboard, because you don't necessarily know what you're going to need right from start. And this is how you can optimize performance and your extracts if you need to remove fields. We'll look at that in a moment. So on this spectrum, just to touch a bit on the technologies, I'm not going to dive too deep in here, but typically for your cold data, you'll have Hadoop. Sometimes with some of the newer technologies, it kind of overlays onto the warm data. So like, for example, Impala is very fast and allows you to get very quick answers and already get kind of prepared data into your analytics. Your relational databases will mostly be also in the warm data area and slightly on the hot side as well. And then analytical databases and Tableau data extracts is really your hot data. So this schema kind of tells us that the further up we are, the more data they have, so the bigger the data size is. And further we go to the right, the performance usually gets better, but mainly because the data is smaller. So don't necessarily think that Hadoop is going to be slow. There are some really great technologies and ways you can set this up so it works fast. But it's just that there's some sort of relationship between the size and the performance, which kind of makes sense. So on this cold data, so who deals with cold data? What are the use cases and some of the technologies? Well, data miners are your typical users that will be connecting to this, that will be doing some data mining, some data exploration, modeling, and then migrating this to a warmer state of data. And the use case, like I said, is data exploration, migrating concepts from warm to hot, and ad hoc reporting as well. So here are some of the technologies as well. And that's your data miners. So let me show you an example of a connection to some cold data, where actually I've set up a connection on my Tableau server and I've facilitated the access to my user to that data. So I've got a new workbook. I'm going to connect to my Tableau server. And as you can see, I've got some Cloudera, Hadoop, Impala, some SQL Server, Excel data, and Tableau data extract. Right now, I just want to connect to Cloudera. Nice. Yeah, true. All right. So actually, my Tableau server is running on my laptop at the moment, so it's my Tableau server trying to access the database. So it's not directly desktop in my local machine. Well, it wouldn't be my local machine. It really would be Tableau server if it ever connects. Oh, I love when this happens. OK, I'll just move on to the next session. Never mind. What I was going to show you here actually is just a quick demo of what it looks like just to connect to this sort of data source through Tableau server. So I would have essentially just connected to that Hadoop database and sent some queries and done just a quick visualization that I would have put together at the end, but I have them prepared so I can reuse them later. So for warm data, we know it already moved from a cold state to a warmer state. And typically here, it's going to be your analysts querying this data. So your analysts that are going to be creating the reports. So it's not yet the end users that are really consuming the reports on a daily basis and interacting with it with filters, et cetera. It's really the ones that are going to be building this. So answering some of the questions, even discovering data, and then migrating those reports. Typically, also, we see that this is regularly analyzed data. So a lot of different reports may be connecting to this sort of data. And people may be consuming this on a daily basis or a weekly basis. Now, some tips. Some tips on how you can optimize some of these connections. This is part of our knowledge base that you can find online quite easily, but I just wanted to remind you some of these because in case you don't have to search for it. So first of all, when you enable support for referential integrity, this allows Tableau to do join calling. Join calling, when you have a connection, a live connection to a relational database with a lot of tables that are joined together, Tableau will actually just query the relevant table. Right? So when you're querying like on a specific column, then it'll just query that table rather than all of the tables together. So really good for optimizing your performance as a user. for those live connections. And this is doable in Tableau Desktop, by the way. Database permissions for supporting creating temp tables. Tableau Desktop may be creating temporary tables to optimize some of that performance. So make sure that your database administrators have authorized that to happen. Again, on the database administrator side, creating index for those tables. Typically on frequently used filters. So filters that are used a lot by the end user in their dashboards. That's very useful. Yep. I think we re-index everything on our own. Yeah, we do.
This is only for live connections.
Yeah, this is only for live connections. I've got another one for extract. The question for those who didn't hear, by the way, it was when we create an extract, does Tableau pick up the indexes that have been defined in the database, or do we recreate our own? And we recreate our own indexes. And finally, break up your data. So if you know what your users will need, you can break up those tables. Don't necessarily give them a huge table. Break it up and give them exactly what they need, which actually you can do with extracts as well. So let's have a look at some. Let's see if I can make this work now. SQL Server. Seems like it's working. OK, so what happened here? I try to connect to a SQL Server data source that's been published on Tableau Server. And Tableau Server is asking me for credentials. We'll go a bit deeper into security here just a bit later, but essentially what this is doing is I need to authenticate to that data source through Tableau Server, and I'm going to inherit the security settings that have been set up in SQL Server, meaning that if I'm only able to see data coming from France, then I would only see data coming from France. All right. OK. So now I've got access to data that may have been prepared. You see I've got some groups that I can retrieve, so that metadata I was talking about. I've got some calculated fields that were created for me. Now notice that as a user in Tableau Desktop, if I want to edit a calculated field, I can't actually edit the calculated field itself. I need to create a copy first. So this really prevents me from actually modifying those calculated fields and then changing that for the rest of the users. So let's just do a quick viz. Always nice to see a viz during a presentation. And let's take league, player, team. So we're looking at batting average and home runs per year. Yeah.
So you had to supply credentials in order to get into that data source. I looked at an Oracle one yesterday, and I didn't have the credentials, but I was able to see the query behind it. I couldn't copy the query, oddly, but I could scroll through it and see it without putting in my credentials.
OK, so actually there are two options in terms of authenticating to these databases. Either you can embed the credentials within the connection, so within the Tableau data source, meaning that the person that created this connection can embed his own credentials into that. The other option is, and that's more on the Tableau Server configuration side, is that Tableau Server impersonates you. You can do that with Kerberos as well, with delegation. Essentially what this does is that Tableau Server will take your username from Tableau Server and then authenticate to the database as you automatically. It's just that I haven't done that automatically on my computer, but you can automate, I think that's it, automate the authentication. So probably that's what happened for you.
But I mean, I couldn't, my functionality was limited unless I put in my credentials, but I could see the queries.
What do you mean the queries then?
I could see the query that was in the data source, see it, although it was asking for my credentials, I could still see the query kind of behind it, which I noticed when you went into that one, you couldn't see anything.
Oh, you mean the query like the connection and like the joins to the different tables?
Yeah.
Oh, right, okay. Yeah, so because this is published to the data source, to the data server, sorry, I'm not allowed to see what actually is contained within that data source, like how it was configured, because it's published, it's already published there. If I save a local copy, I can create a local copy and then, yeah, let's do that. Probably what you saw is something like this, but you were authenticated automatically. So what I've done here is I created a separate copy from the one that's on the server. And you saw something like this with like drawings like that?
Yeah, I actually saw the underlying query, but bottom line is you won't be able to see any of the details of it.
No, yeah, yeah. Yeah.
So you're doing a live connection, right?
Yeah.
So you've created a data source. When you say that in the Tableau server data source functionality, what you've done is rather than have them connect directly to the data warehouse, you've created maybe a subset or file view or wherever you think the requirements are, and you've created something smaller, but you still have to go to the database.
Yeah. So the question for those who didn't hear is what I'm doing at the moment is connecting through Tableau server, but what is really this thing that I'm connecting to? And what is it actually doing? Well, actually this is so the Tableau data source I was talking about, but in the details of that Tableau data source, it's a live connection to the database. So it's just rerouting me to the actual database. I'm going to kill this. All right. Okay, and so our last state of data is our hot data. So this is typically going to be for your end users, the people that are consuming the dashboard that have already been created, people that are doing web authoring, and people that are, so for BI applications or dashboards, it's going to be used typically to speed up workbooks as well, speed up queries. But also an important point is to isolate to isolate the query from the data source, from the initial source. Say you have a database that's been a bit overwhelmed by loads of queries coming from lots of different dashboards. Well, creating an extract in this scenario would isolate the data source and allow you to kind of leave some breathing space for your database. So some tips on optimizing extracts. This is more for the Tableau desktop users. One functionality that you may or may have not seen before is the optimize extract functionality. The optimize extract functionality, essentially what it does is that it materializes the calculations that you've created. So Tableau will save the results of this calculation within the extract. So whenever you're reusing that, it'll just go look for the results rather than recompute the calculation. It's a really useful one. To show you, here I'm using an extract. If I go to the extract functionality, I've got an optimize option. Okay, yeah. Is there a reason? The question was, is there a reason that this is not a default? It's a good question. Let me get back to you on that. Okay. Aggregate to visible dimensions. This second one is quite important as well. This is one that would potentially reduce the size of your extract. The way you do this is when you click on extract data, you've got an option here to aggregate data for visible dimensions. What this means is that any dimension that you're not using in your view, Tableau will aggregate to that level. So it'll take them away and say, for example, you have category and subcategory. If you're not using subcategory and removing that, then Tableau will just aggregate all the lines to the category level, so drastically reducing the size of that extract. Which can really help as well if you have like extracts that refresh slowly, and that can make them refresh a lot quicker. You can do the same thing for dates, so for aggregating to dates. So if you have a date field with a month, day, year, and hour, minutes, and seconds, and you want to remove that part and just aggregate to the day level, then that can really help. And so a couple more, acceleration views. Acceleration views, this one's kind of a little trick, little Jedi trick as they call it, where you have in the background a view that will pre-compute some long list filters. Long list of discrete filters is usually quite slow to compute for Tableau, even on an extract. So you can have like a view hidden in the background that will have all these filters and pre-cache them. So then it's easier for Tableau to look them up. And finally, using data source filters when you're extracting, Always useful, data source filters on dimensions, but also if you do that on dates, use continuous dates.
You're saying create the view on the data warehouse side, correct?
No, in Tableau. In the Tableau workbook, yeah. The question was, do we create this view for the second last bullet point? Do we create the view in the data warehouse? And actually, no, it's in Tableau. In the Tableau workbook, you'd have an extra sheet that would just preload and pre-cache that. There are some articles online, by the way, about like cache warming in Tableau and how you can work around that. This is one of the examples. Now, data source filters on continuous rather than discrete dates. This is really important. Obviously, continuous fields will be quicker to compute because Tableau will just look for a beginning and an end and take everything in between, rather than looking for the values in each of the lines of the data source. Okay, so let's try one last time to get my data working. But this is an extract, so extracts tend to work. So I've got this extract on my Tableau server again. Let's get our batting average. Yes. There we go. Home runs per year. And let's get league team. Okay. Oop. All right. So quite quick, but a lot less data as well that I'm querying at this moment. All right, so I'm accessing all this data, and we've seen a bit what security can look like when I'm authenticating, when I'm asked to authenticate, even if that happens automatically. There are different ways you can set up security in your Tableau data sources. The first thing we talk about when we talk about security is object-level security and permissions. I remember on the server where we had data sources in projects and workbooks in projects, objects is that content. It's the data source, it's the workbook. So really what you can do is allow users to access certain data sources by giving them permissions to see a project or to see a data source. And that's just for providing access. And for example, locking out production data or locking out test data to production users. Now the second type of security we talk about is row-level security. Row-level security, there are three options. First, the completely managed by the database. Completely managed by the database, one of the disadvantages, even though it's one of the things I would recommend the most, at least it's one of the best practices, is that you need live connections. Obviously, once you extract the data, then you're not connecting live to that, and the database is not able to authenticate you. So all end users as well must exist in that database. So any Tableau server users that are logging to Tableau server, logging to these data sources, or logging to these dashboards, the database must be able to recognize these users. So they must exist over there. And end users need to log as themselves into the database. And like the question you asked, you can save your credentials, so you don't have to do this every time you're connecting to a data source. The second option is my favorite one, actually. This is a hybrid connection. The reason why it's my favorite one is because you can use live connections, but you can also use extracts. The way that works is that we use the data server, and we use data source filters. And on the data source filters, we use this function called username, parenthesis. Username equals the column from a security table. So what you need is just in your database, you need a security table, which essentially is just a column with the username and then a column with what that user can see. So for example, I would see the French lines and you would see all the American lines, like that. that's a table you need to create in your database. And so what that does is yeah. The thing you could do, though, is with cross-database joins is have a little Excel sheet that can manage that. I've done this. Yeah, but I see people laughing at this. Yeah. And the final option is completely managed in Tableau Server, in Tableau Desktop. This works on Live or Extract, but it's really not typical in enterprise deployments because this is done on a workbook level. So it's workbook by workbook. You can manually add user filters where you have to tick a bunch of fields to say, well, this user can see that, this user can see that. So it's really manual and not, it doesn't scale very well. So just some information on how can you choose, which is the best for you. So first of all, do you have a data warehouse? If yes, do you have credentials saved in there? If yes, then probably the option 1 is the best for you. If you do have a data warehouse but you don't have user credentials, then do you have a mapping table? If yes, then option 2. But in the case of what you guys seem not to have is probably then option 3 or option 1. And if you don't have data warehouse and you don't have security mapping table, then option 3, doing this manually in Tableau Desktop. So for the end user, what does this look like? How can the end user kind of navigate through all these different data sources that we've given him, different temperatures of data as well, if I can call it like this? Well, first of all is that for the end user, it always starts with a business question. So somebody in sales will go and say, well, I need to figure out my sales by country. Somebody in marketing would want to know results from a social media campaign. Somebody in engineering would want to know, what was results of engine test from their sensors. So how do those users and how does the data navigate through the different states? Well, typically we start from the cold data. The cold data then moves to the warm area where you have your analyst that creates the reports. And then that moves into the hot area where consumers will deal with dashboards and filter and drill down, etc. But the important point I want to make here is that you're authoring from left to right, but then you can also consume from right to left. And the reason why I'm showing this is because I'll show you in a moment how you can have your end users be guided into their lower level of detail into the cold data without having to go out of their dashboard or create something new, but really integrate everything in one really simple dashboard where they can go from one to another and drill down without you having to get all the data out of these systems and put it and reshape it and put it somewhere else. So the secret weapon for this little trick is action filters. With action filters, you start with your hot data. You're usually very highly aggregated summary data, very high performance. So when a user logs in, the first thing he sees, it kind of comes up quite quickly. Then with action filters, the user drills down into some warm data where you have row-level security, live connections. But already we're filtering to a smaller perimeter of data, sorry. So we're not querying as much data, so the performance is usually a bit better. And finally, you use action filters to go down into the cold data as well. So you really drill down into the details, and the point is that you leave all of that data in the appropriate data architecture. You don't have to move it around so people can get to that finer level of detail. So let me show you how that works. Hopefully it will work now. So I've got this dashboard. One view was built coming from my extract. The second one comes from my SQL Server, and the third and fourth comes from the Hadoop Impala. So let's click on something. I'm glad that worked. So now I'm opening a view automatically coming from SQL Server. So through that action filter, I'm actually also changing data source. And I can do that as well now if I click on the sheet that's coming from this one. I'll show you how I was doing this. So now what I've done is actually I've queried this Hadoop data where I have information on Europe, player, league, team, a whole bunch of metrics as well that is quite low level of detail, but I really came from that high level aggregated extract that gave me the right performance. The way you do this is by simply just selecting the sheet with the action filters. You select the source sheet, being the extract, and then the target sheet, in this case it's the SQL. And really what's important is to click this exclude all values. The reason is because when you're first going to log into that dashboard, it's not going to load all the ones that have been excluded. It's only going to load them once you've clicked on something. So the users get to that first bit of information very quickly. And I've done the same thing for the drill down too, where you can use those other sheets to drill down into the Hadoop part. And you can do that as well across dashboards. So this is an example where you've got a first dashboard just using extract data. And then I can have some nice action filters that makes me go to the second dashboard, the SQL Server dashboard, and then go down to the Hadoop dashboard.
Is that link that you just clicked on populated by the action filter?
Yep. Yep. So the way you create that link, actually, if I go to Dashboard Actions, if you click on this menu, rather than select, so you have different ways of running an action. You've got the hover, the select, and the menu. The menu will make it appear. And then you can make it a bit dynamic and look nice for the end user. It's a neat trick. So then I can do the same thing and go to the Hadoop part. There we go. And now I'm at the finest detail. All right, now that we've been using these data sources, what can I do to audit them? What can I do to control how they're used? Are there any data sources that are not being used that I can get rid of? So there are two ways you can audit your data sources. One of them first is server auditing. So you may be familiar with some of the admin views that are already made for you. There are about 9 of them. One of them is on data sources, so it can give you data source usage by project, by day, how are they used, how often are they used. So I'll show you this in my server. In my status tab. Traffic to data sources. So you see I've got information. So I've got data sources that are in my production data that have been used 28 times in the past couple days. That shows how much I practiced. Sandbox data. 51 used today. The user, that's just me, unfortunately, but yeah. And then the different data sources that I've got. So really useful to monitor this. And the other point I want to mention is that you also have the possibility to connect to the repository underneath Tableau Server. That repository will give you access to a whole bunch of data that then can allow you to do your own custom dashboards and really find out a lot more about your data sources in that view with those 4 sheets that we are showing you. And also what you can do is audit your data sources within your workbook. This is the performance recording option in Tableau Desktop. So if I do some performance recording on my first sheet, let's revert to 0. In my help menu, I can then go and see what was the query that was sent to the data source. Okay, I'm going to stop that. Wait a second for the dashboard to appear. You can do this in Tableau Server as well, by the way, so it's not just in Tableau Desktop. But now I have information. Well, I just drilled down to one database, but if I drill to the other one, I would have had information on this and on the query that's been generated. So I can also monitor, what is the performance through this sort of little trick. Okay, so to wrap up on all of this, just a few points on what makes a successful strategy, and hopefully that would have made sense to you guys. But really, who it benefits, who benefits from a successful strategy? Sorry, the end users. So your analysts, your data scientists, and your data consumers, they get easy access to data, to certified or exploratory data. They can understand the data model a lot better. They can have optimized performance and collaboration with metadata that has been created by their colleagues. For the database owners and the data stewards, more security, more control, you can monitor as well. And that single version of the truth, which is really important for all of us. And finally, for your company, more data to more people securely and quicker business decisions. So thank you for listening. I can take questions, and please don't forget to fill in the survey.